in my own recovery, one of the things that I came upon is this idea that there was so much information out there, Michael, that said, you had to be stronger, you had to be tougher, you had to get grit, you had to get downright, kind of white knuckle your health and your recovery. However, what I found is that you can't hate yourself healthy.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Here on the follow-up question, I am on a mission. I'm on a mission to help us find common ground. I think that's severely lacking these days. The ability to ask questions of someone, listen, so that we might find the things that make us uniquely the same, the shared experiences that uncover the humanity in us. That's my goal. And as a former journalist, I'm going to do that by interviewing people from all different backgrounds and perspectives who I think have an incredible story to share here on this show that, again, hopefully helps us find that common ground. This week on the show, I welcome Dr. Robyne Hanley-Dafoe. Now, if I say the word resiliency, what comes to your mind? Do you think of gritting your teeth through a hard situation and powering through, pushing through, grinding, the grind, right? So often when we bring up the word resiliency, we think of it like this battle, this fight, this war that we're raging against a situation, against circumstance. And here in this episode, you're going to hear from Robyne a different approach, a different tact to thinking about resiliency. Robyne is the author of the book Calm Within the Storm, A Pathway to Everyday Resiliency, where she talks about a powerful and achievable, yet kind and calm and compassionate approach to thinking about resiliency in everyday life so that we can know down to our core that we have been kind to ourselves and that we can do hard things, that we remove fear and shame, and that we feel trustworthy, that we feel trustful, and that we feel safe, so that we can grow, we can accept the things that have happened, and we can change, we can adapt. And if there's ever been a year, a 12-month period where we have had to be resilient and change and adapt to a new set of circumstances, hasn't it been the last 12 months? What a uniquely relevant topic for the time and place that we are in. So be sure to listen to the end where I give you a few wrap-up thoughts before we close out the episode. And then don't forget to subscribe to The Follow-Up, which is my weekly newsletter that comes out every Friday morning, where I dive deep on a particular topic or theme from that week's episode. You can sign up. The link is in the show notes. You can go to thefollowupquestion.com/newsletter. And with that, here is my conversation with Dr. Robyne Hanley-Dafoe. I actually want to read you something from your book because I want your thoughts on it. I pulled out and I actually highlighted this topic or this paragraph in your book. It says, resiliency is not reserved for the mentally tough, the strong, or the fearless. Each person has the capacity for resiliency. It is not something you have or do not have. It is not something you are born with. When a person lives an examined life, they come upon this knowledge. Robyne, what does it mean to live an examined life and have that knowledge?
Great question, Michael. So from my perspective, what that looks like is that we are in the present moment. And we're aware of what's going on. We're mindful. We're showing up in our lives every single day. There's a lot of pressure in our cultures to very much be on autopilot. We have to go quick. We have to go harder, faster, get things done, work wisely. What I come upon in my work is that people tend to get pulled into two different sections. One, they get really pulled into the past, their old story. They get stuck with, notions of shame and regret. And I see people really experience a lot of depressive type, I'm stuck here and my life could never look different. And on the other side, I see folks who forecast the future so far out that they just create all this anxiety for themselves, that they don't know what's next. And they want that predictability and that certainty, which isn't always there. So living an examined life to me is that we're present. We see what's going on and we see it accurately and we see it consistently. So to me, that's what it looks like. And I also think that leads into it, Michael, of living rightly, where we establish our values and how we show up, how we want to be of service, and what matters most to us.
That rush, that pressure to always be on the go that you just referenced, you talk about that in the book of how we so often want to rush the process. We want to get through the act of getting through a difficult situation or trauma. Why do we do that in your experience? Why do we feel like we have to rush that process?
Yeah, so I think by our very nature, we are very impatient people. And again, I feel as though that's a wee bit our biology, where we just kind of like to have that reward, that what's next type of phenomena. But I also think it's very much a conditioned response, that we are trained since we were wee ones, that we're supposed to like be happy all the time, or we're supposed to be in problem solving mode. We need to always be doing that next thing. Very rarely are we encouraged in our lives to like slow down and let things be. Let them unfold, to be patient. So we're very much conditioned to always be in motion, always to be striving, to a point where there's a cost to it, where people are feeling rattled and wobbly and uncertain, and they're feeling as though they're running on quicksand, versus actually establishing life practices that keep them firmly planted on a more solid foundation.
Why is that so important to establish those practices and to slow down?
Yeah, well, I think it's the only way we can really kind of take note of what's going on. When you're constantly in motion, I think of it as a wee bit of a trauma response. People don't want to know what's underneath. So they just keep busy, they keep going, they keep striving, because left to their own devices by themselves, I think people will start to revisit parts of their lives or their experiences or their realities, which they might not like. So by staying constantly busy, we don't actually let any of those emotions and that healing catch up to us. So it's very much a defense mechanism to always be busy, to always be thinking what's next. It takes a wee bit of discipline to reprogram that pacing for ourselves, that for sure we want to be hungry for our goals. We want to be striving for our idea of personal excellence, not what the world tells us is personal excellence. You in your bones, that you know, this is my best authentic self. We want people to land there, but I think there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of distraction.
Robyne, how did you come to that level of understanding? I know you write about having trauma and certainly in early childhood, having dealt with things. Can you just walk through for the audience how you've come to what you just described, that level of understanding that we need to slow down and see our process to rush as a trauma response in some instances?
Yeah, great question, Michael. So, of course, in the book, I go into quite a bit of detail about some of the challenges and setbacks that I experienced growing up. And very much, I think what differentiates a lot of my challenges, Michael, versus some other folks is that to a point, a lot of them were self-inflicted. This wasn't that I grew up in a circumstances or a household where I was fighting obstacles that the world was putting on my shoulders. I very much created many of the storms that I had to figure my way through. And I think sometimes that differentiates some of the other approaches that people talk about resiliency or understanding living an examined life. I created my storms. I had to find a way through my storms. And again, it came from many different places. It came from like psychological, physical, emotional, like there were a lot of different challenges that I had to try and figure out. And in my own recovery, one of the things that I came upon is this idea that there was so much information out there, Michael, that said, you had to be stronger, you had to be tougher, you had to get grit, you had to get downright, kind of white knuckle your health and your recovery. However, what I found is that you can't hate yourself healthy. You can't shame yourself into a new beginning. I found that we needed to take a gentler approach. And it wasn't until I started kind of working on the inside, not just out on the outside, that I was able to start to find a deeper understanding of what human resiliency looks like.
Robyne, as I was reading the book, the the word that kept coming to mind and what you just highlighted there is kindness. Like, I just felt your writing and your approach to this topic was so kind. And even you, I believe you used the phrase in the book, I became stronger when I became calmer. And
Yes.
I equate calm with kindness. That level of kindness, like, where did that intentionality come from to approach this topic from a very kind and calm place?
Yeah, well, I can tell you in full disclosure, I wasn't always that calm and I wasn't always that kind. In earlier versions of my own development, I struggled with other ways. I tried other ways first. As I said, I tried hating myself healthy. I tried, really coming at this from a really aggressive approach of trying to like figure out my baggage, get things in check, a very almost militant or tactical approach of just getting tougher. What I realized that the tougher I became, the more disconnected I felt with the things that mattered most. When I started to pause and really honor and recognize my values, like what matters most to me? How do I want to show up for the people who count on me and depend on me? When I started to revisit some of those ideas of like, how do I want to be? How do I want to experience my time on our planet? I realized it wasn't the uglier, tougher approach that I was curious about. I was really curious about how do we find a way to like forgive ourselves? How do we find a way to practice compassion? One thing that I learned about myself going through lots of different challenges, I was so quick to forgive other people. Like I stayed way too long in way too many situations. I gave folks benefits of the doubt. I gave people second, third, dozens of chances. And I realized I never extended that same courtesy to myself. I never gave myself, I held myself to this pressure point where you were supposed to be better. And there was a ton of shame that I carried with part of my old story. And I realized that wasn't serving me. And it took a long time to realize that there's another approach. And when I went looking and seeking that approach by doing the work I do with studying resiliency, I realized that there was like every once in a while you would come upon a person who found a different way, who didn't focus necessarily on this like harder tactical approach to it, that they actually practiced a more calm, centering, a grounded, like a slower approach, so to speak. And they had significant better results than people who were trying to shame themselves into wellness.
So, Robyne, you talk about your childhood. You write about in the book your self-inflicted trauma that you just talked about, but you also talk about a very real experience of trauma in the car accident. How do we deal with, and please, like, let's start there.
Yeah.
Can you explain for the audience who perhaps hasn't read the book yet, and I suggest that they do, the childhood trauma you talk about? What are you referencing there? Like specifically, what were you dealing with as a child, and where do you feel that bubbled up from?
Yeah. So great question. Again, complicated answer, but essentially there was this very deep disconnect with feeling worthy, feeling as though I was enough, feeling as though I was deserving of this pretty epic life that I was presented with. I had phenomenal family systems, enormous amounts of support. And for some reason, I picked up this narrative when I was very young, like I'm talking like in grade 2, like 7 years old. All of a sudden, I didn't feel worthy. I felt like my parents, like they loved me so hard. However, like there was just something that created this sense of this mental script that I internalized that said that, that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough for them. I wasn't good enough for my family system. And, what I came upon is that I felt just this huge hole. Like I felt this gaping wound, which I never put words to. I felt deep shame and fear, things that I didn't really even know what perpetuated it, or what kind of started it, but it was there. And then what I found is that, all of a sudden when the world starts kind of lowering their expectations of you. So for example, in the school system, they started kind of putting me down grades. I was, not expected to do very well in school. I found myself in positions where that led to a lot of bullying. Whenever we segregate children as different, basically, I feel as though you're putting a target on a child's back. I became an easy target, and I experienced some pretty substantive bullying that by today's standards, a lot of people, including grownups, would get in trouble for. But at the time, that was, for some reason, that just kind of went undetected. I developed a pretty substantive, challenging, and in retrospect, we know it was a mental health condition. At the time, we didn't use that terminology. We didn't say like, oh, here's a hyperactive little girl who now has gotten herself spiraling into some of this high risk behavior. We didn't talk about that. And that wasn't even that long ago, but we didn't talk about children that way, especially girls. I think there was always a wee bit of a discussion about young boys being like really impulsive and having some hyperactivity. But that wasn't really dialogue that we had for young girls. But that behavior does lead to risk-taking behavior. And I found myself in the wrong crowd in more than one way. And that was really kind of a really dark season for me. Going into 16, I was already navigating this mental health condition that we didn't call mental health, navigating addictions. And again, there was a lot of shame being someone in, my family wasn't, I wasn't from a family of persons who had navigated addictions. Like this was a new dimension that I had brought into our household. During that season though, Michael, I had actually dropped out of high school. I had changed high school a few times, trying to kind of run away from needing those fresh starts, right? Just thinking, this time I'm going to get it right. This time I'll be able to fix it. That didn't end how I had hoped. And I had dropped out of school yet again. And my parents stood by me. They really were phenomenal at identifying that what was within their control and what wasn't within their control as parents. And they were my supporters. They didn't rescue me. They supported me the best that they could, but they knew that I had to find some of this learning on my own. I had to learn my own lessons. And again, the accident that you referred to, that happened when I was 16. I was driving home late at night by myself in a snowstorm. And I was alone in the car, and I was on a very deserted patch of road. And when that blizzard came about, I lost control of the vehicle quite quickly, and my vehicle went off the road and it went down an embankment, and my vehicle ended up crashing into the Otonabee River, which is a large waterway in Ontario. And my vehicle went through the ice, and I was trapped inside. And I recall actually in that moment, Michael, that I wasn't actually feeling afraid. I wasn't actually even feeling scared. I was feeling pretty angry. I was angry that I could not protect my family from this, that this was just this huge event that now my parents were going to have to bury a daughter in this circumstance. I was also a wee bit angry that all of those psychologists and psychiatrists who said I wouldn't survive to my 18th birthday, that I felt like I just proved them right, that I wasn't going to make it. And that made me feel pretty upset. And when I started thinking about the notion of being separated from my mother, that I was going to leave her behind to deal with this collateral damage that was her daughter, it was as if, I write about in the book, it was as if it was an emotional echo that just kind of rang through my bones that said, no, Robyne does hard things. And I recall in that moment deciding that I would survive. I would not die like that. And I recall I had my winter boots on and a big winter coat, and the seatbelt. I couldn't even get the seatbelt off just because of all the water pressure and whatnot. So I had to wiggle out through the seatbelt. I couldn't actually get the car door open. Just the water pressure was just too great. So I got out through the driver's side window, and I recall getting out through that window, and I couldn't actually tell which way was up or down. The vehicle was kind of churning along the bottom, and I couldn't get my bearings. And it was, this really, anyway, I realized the only way to actually get my sense of direction was to let go of my breath that I'd been holding all of that time, because I knew my bubbles would rise. And then I recall swimming after those bubbles with all of my might. And then there was this like hot ripping pain along my face, and couldn't figure out what was happening in that moment. Then I realized it was my face hitting the ice, and I was pinned under the ice. And I chose to just keep trying to next step. So I swam deeper into the channel, deeper into the darkness, and finally found a place where I can get my torso onto an ice shield. Now that night, there just happened to be a gentleman by the name of Joseph Todd, just a random guy in his 30s driving home from shift work. And he just happened to see my car tracks go off the road. And he just happened to drive along that side of the road to see if he could see someone. And in that blizzard, he somehow came upon my body out on the ice. He pulled over his pickup truck. He actually crawled out onto the ice and he brought a chain with him and he wrapped that chain around my body and he dragged me to shore. He was awarded an award of bravery, which is the highest honor in Canada for risking his life to save a stranger. And I recall, Michael, I woke up in the hospital a while later and my family was there. My mother was standing there. And one of the things she asked me about was how I did that. How on earth did you get yourself out of that? And I recall looking at my wee mom and telling her, well, you did tell me I could do hard things. And I remember her response was, dear Lord, daughter, that is not what we ever talked about. But what I learned in that moment very much became the origin story as believing in comebacks, believing that as long as we're still here, there's a different way of becoming. And that very much started me finding a recovery that would not be linear and it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't like this, like in Canada, we talk about these TSN turning points in sports, right? It's like boom happened. And then all of a sudden the momentum changed. It was a slow, steady, messy recovery, but I can say that that was 25 years ago, and I'm still grateful every moment for the fact that my miracle was in motion and Joseph was there, and we got myself out.
Robyne, how much time do you then spend on trying to reflect on why you had the feelings of unworthiness and shame as a child, especially when you have such a pivotal change point in your life? How much time do you spend going back and dissecting that versus, hey, I've got this second chance. I'm just going to, as you say, do the next right thing. I say do the next hard thing all the time, so I really resonate with that.
Yes.
How much time do you spend or did you spend going back and trying to solve the issue of unworthiness?
Mm-hmm. Great question, Michael. So I can tell you, I spent quite a bit of time trying to stick handle and navigate that during my recovery. Certain places where I sought treatment and support, they very much were curious about some of those old stories. One of the things that I did come upon, though, quite quickly is that no one was ever going to know why. There was never going to be like, oh, here was this event that happened when she was 3, and that's why Robyne's like this. There was never going to be a definitive answer. There was always just going to be speculation. And I actually found the speculation more frustrating, just kind of like trying to figure out these why questions. That why question was like literally like trapped in my head. And it just used to swirl around kind of like a bat in an echo chamber. Like I just could not get rid of the why questions as to why did I get saved? Why was I rescued? Why do other kids not make it through? Like we could just pelt ourselves blue with why questions. So I could say it was pretty, a few years after that, when I was in my mid-20s, 30s, when I realized those why questions weren't getting us anywhere. It was not serving us in any capacity because it was always going to be speculative and I could never change it. But what I couldn't do was make the next right decision. So when I shifted from putting all of my focus and energy onto trying to dissect the past and moved to what's the next right decision? Like what do I have to do now? What can I do with my time left? I noticed it felt like just this monumental shift all the way through my head and my heart. Like it literally just felt like my soul finally said, good. Now you're asking the right questions. Because I felt as though before that it wasn't authentic. I was trying to find answers that didn't exist in this lifetime. So I can share with you that once I had that shift, realizing, you know what, my future has far more opportunities than my past. And I've learned to do this, Michael, I only revisit the past with a purpose. Like I'm specifically remembering something that I want to remember. I specifically revisit the past with intention. I don't just go up as a tourist to walk through my past and my past experiences and wonder like, I wonder what that was like. I only go back there with a purpose to maybe remember, a childhood experience that was positive. And I've really trained myself to look back on my past with fondness, to find moments that, stuck out that were significant. Because my childhood was peppered with beautiful moments as well. Like it wasn't as though I had this really, dark season that was the whole time. I somehow got off course. I stumbled and stayed down a little bit longer than I wanted to. But when I started realizing that there wasn't any shame anymore, that there wasn't any service to myself by being stuck to my old story, then I could start to remember more of the positives, and I could look back in a fond way. And what I've learned going into, again, as a parent of 3 teenagers, I'm watching them experience their adolescence. And my information or my suggestion I offer my children often is, during adolescence, don't waste a mistake. I spent so many times hiding my mistakes, being shame-filled with my mistakes. And I realized I missed out the opportunity, Michael, to learn some lessons along the way. And I needed to learn them. I didn't. So I had to learn them in a pretty catastrophic way. But what I see with our 3 children is that they're not afraid of their mistakes. They're not wasting a mistake. They're learning, they're changing, adapting, being nimble, flexible, whatever they have to do to figure out what their next right decision is. So I think there's been a lot of healing for me by wanting to be a parent to them that sets them on a positive trajectory.
Let's take it a little bit further out then.
Sure.
You've talked about a shift.
Yeah.
It's now March 2021. Over the last year, we have all collectively gone through a monstrous shift, a monumental shift. You call it course correction versus a new normal. And new normal is the phrase that everyone has used. Why is it important to you to make the distinction between new normal and course correction?
Yeah, again, great question. Okay, so there's nothing normal about what is going on. There's nothing normal of the amount of people who have been negatively impacted by COVID. There's nothing normal about a needed racial reckoning that is unfolding across North America. There's nothing normal about any of that. And when we call it normal, I think it's actually, in a way, condoning a lot of this. It's condoning a lot of some pretty substantive systematic issues. If we say, oh, well, we just now have to accept this as our new normal. No, this is a course correction. We have to do a lot of repair. There's a lot of relationship repair that needs to be done with many of our different communities. There's relationship repair that needs to be done in terms of, from a social justice perspective, in terms of who's getting care and who's not getting care. And again, I think that's something that if we ever associate that with normal, we're condoning a lot of the things that are going on right now, which in my opinion, again, across the United States and Canada, it's not okay. It's not okay what's happening. So I don't want normal to be brought into that. Course correction, yeah, we have to change. We have to adapt and adjust. We do need to make some different decisions because there are real world consequences. So to me, course correction identifies that there's been an error. New normal means we just have to accept the current landscape. Course correction acknowledges that we've actually made mistakes and we need to get back on track.
What are we fighting then when we fight against course correction, when we want it to be, when things go back to normal? What are we fighting against?
I think we're fighting against this kind of predictability and certainty that we had before, where we just want things to go back to the good old days or the ways that they were. And what's interesting, when I hear people talk so fondly about 2020 prior to COVID, I feel as though they forgot of the fact that we weren't actually that healthy. We were celebrating, for example, in the workforce, we were celebrating exhaustion as a measuring tool of success. Families were hurting. People were struggling. There weren't, quote, good old days of 2020 pre-COVID. There was just routines and habits and patterns that we were more familiar with. So when people are trying to get back to what it was, I struggle with that a wee bit personally, because I don't think it was particularly great before COVID struck. If anything, I feel as though COVID's been this huge spotlight that has shone upon a lot of these injustices and a lot of these broken parts. So my hope is that there's going to be lessons learned. There's going to be accountability in terms of our personal accountability. Each and every one of us can make a difference in the system. And I appreciate that so many folks get so discouraged. They say, Robyne, these systems are so broken. Well, you are part of the system. And even our small changes, I think when those things are done rightly, the small things, it's going to equal a big result. So all of a sudden, if we start learning, again, not wasting the lessons of what COVID has brought for us. And again, I just want to clarify, I'm not saying that there's like a silver lining in everything. And I actually speak in the book about the fact We need to stop looking for silver linings because sometimes things just suck. Some things are just awful and they're horrible. And it's not that we ever have to come to terms with it. It's the fact that we need to just recognize it is what it is, and we need to just make the next choice out of it. So I think from this notion of normal moving forward, we need to accept responsibility. We were part of these systems. We were part of these systems that were, putting our work ahead of our families. We were these systems that were ignoring our health and our wellness for capitalism, right? So these are things that I'm thinking about in terms of course correction.
As a doctor, as someone who has spent time in the world of psychology and in academia, as an observer of what's going on right now, we see criticism, we see downplaying, we see outright dismissal of facts now, yes, and so much emotion tied into it. That criticism, that dismissal, where do you see that coming from? Where does that spur or spawn up from in some of us, in all of us?
Where I think a lot of that comes from, Michael, is actually fear. I think the vast majority of anger, if you pull anger aside, underneath, you're going to see a scared child. If you pull frustration aside, what you're going to see is somebody who's feeling helpless. I think a lot of it comes from fear. And people, again, we're very weary of change. We don't like things that are different. However, once we realize that we're always in a state of change, that's part of the evolution. That's part of the human condition. As soon as we come onto this planet, we're already growing and changing. It's just in our very nature that we're always evolving. But there's some people that are very much trying to hold on to moments. They're hold on to belief systems or values that they were maybe born into or they've grown to adopt. They don't want to let that go because it's very much part of their identity. And when all of a sudden we're asking people to change their identity, that's going to create a lot of an ego battle. And what I see right now is there is a rampant ego battle. And I think that's actually the anecdote we're starting to see people trying to address that ego battle is all of a sudden stoicism's come back in favor, right? These are people that they were talking about that thousands of years ago. And I love that there's a group of folks who they won't talk about their own emotional health, but they will go back thousands of years into stoicism and use that to address real world problems. And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge advocate of stoicism and there's amazing lessons to be learned there. But what I just think it's interesting is people are desperate for something and they're literally going back to the basics. They are literally going back to wow, we're in an ego struggle. This is pride. This is fear. We're going right back to the core.
You also write in the book about the pillars of a resilient person, and community or belonging is one of those. The question that came up in my mind as I was reading that and going through the time that we're in, where our community and our sense of belonging with others, because we're not physically with each other, has been stripped away. Do you have concerns about how we come out of this and build community and rebuild that sense of belonging?
That's a really interesting question. So yes, of the 5 pillars, belonging is the first one that I talk about. Belonging to me is just so absolutely crucial that people have that psychological safety. We need a home team. We need to have people in our corner. Now, I think that's interesting though, when we think about belonging, a lot of times people feel as though that means we have to be in one another's immediate presence. We are connected to persons and we have a sense of belonging. It doesn't mean we have to be in the same household. We don't even have to be in the same state or province. So it's this idea that come what may, there are people that are going to be standing behind you. Maybe they are in your household, which is great. And you are, in lockdown with them, which is a bonus. But for many of us, our family systems or our home team, they might not necessarily be with us, but they have a legacy with helping us feel safe. So maybe they are distant, but you do still feel that connection. I actually take it a step further and think very much the idea about we also come from a long line of persons, right? We think about our ancestry. I feel as though there's parts of our ancestry and our ancestral paths and journeys that are also, we carry those with us. And we've learned about that through understanding Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous knowledge holders talk about, we're not just us, there's more to to us. There's more substantive and essence to us. So I think even that there's a connection to persons that might not even still be here. And again, not to be like woo-woo or anything, but again, like we can get strength from people who've left us. We can get strength and a sense of belonging and our values and our sense of purpose from people who aren't here anymore. So I don't think it just has to be that physical community that we can see. It's the fact that we truly feel as though there's a place that we can call home. And it doesn't have to be a physical building. A home is not bricks and mortar. It's that sense of I am valued, I am heard, I am seen, and I still have work to do. So I think on the other side of COVID, which I am confident we are going to get to, I think of 2020 as round one. Like if you think about it as in a boxing match, it's round one. Okay. We learned about our opponent. We got a good sense of what was going on. 2021 is when we're now having to figure out pacing, right? So when you think about a boxer, then they have to feel about pacing, get a sense of, okay, what are my strengths? How do I work this? And I think 2022 is going to be our comeback, and it's going to look different for everyone. And again, we will find community. We're already part of community, but it's very much finding those people around us that make us see valued and be heard and seen. And I also think in that 2020 comeback, it's no surprise when we look from a historical perspective that like after the Spanish flu, like ravaged 1918 and onward, we had the roaring 20s where people literally wore like dresses to go get milk, right? People wore, top hats and had parties and dancing and music and merriment because they were having their comeback. And my hope, and I live hope-filled, is that 2022, it's going to be a really great comeback for everyone, but there will be lessons to be learned. And the craft will be, can we take those lessons and bring them into our next phase or the next season of our lives?
I believe you describe it as, if I have it right, 2020 was like the decline phase of the resiliency path. 2021 will be the learning stage, the adapting stage, and then 2022 is the growth and beyond stage. So
the rise.
The rise. I can get behind that.
I love it.
How we respond to other people who are dealing with issues of resiliency, who may not feel resilient or who are having a hard time. You use the phrase hold space. And to me, again, just another kind approach to it. Can you describe for the listeners what you mean by holding space for someone?
Yeah. So I think the best way I was ever taught about the notion of holding space is that, so let's say you're talking to a loved one or a family member or a friend, and they're in a dark place right now. Let's say that they're down a well, so to speak. A lot of us, we actually just like climb in the well as well. We literally are like, oh, you're down. I'm going to jump down there with you. And now you're both stuck in a very dark place. So holding space means I'm going to sit beside this well. I'm not going down there to rescue you because it's actually going to put us both in a difficult situation. I'm going to sit next to this well and I'm going to talk you through it. I am not going to leave you. I'm going to let you know that you do you, whatever you have to do, whatever lessons you have to learn. I'm not going to meet it with criticism or judgment. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to meet you with rescuing or telling you how to solve your problems. I'm simply going to let you know you don't have to walk it alone. So what I think about when I see persons having fluctuation with resiliency, that in itself is absolutely normal. Resiliency is not something it's all or nothing or 100% or zero. Resiliency will ebb and flow. It's not meant to be even. There's going to be some areas in your life that you are extremely resilient in. And then there's going to be areas where you're like, nope, this is not my field of expertise. But in times like that, again, this goes back to the very first question you asked me about living an examined life. Know where your weak points are. Know where, yes, I'll have to have some help here. Know where you need to do that heavy lifting. So when we hold space, we say to somebody, I'm here and you don't have to walk it alone. It doesn't mean we're going to fix it for you. I'm not going to carry it and I'm not getting down that well. I'll stay with you. But again, it's also that revisiting the notion that resiliency isn't meant to be even. It's not something you have or don't have. You're not born with it or not born with it. It's this notion that it's something that we have to cultivate. We have to foster it. And how we do that is through our wellness practices. You have to be well to be able to stay well.
Holding space, the way you describe it, it sounds all well and good, but you and I both know that's really hard for people to do, right? We always are in a rush to fix, to jump down into that well, like you said.
Yeah.
my question in this is that a lack of resiliency on our part to not simply hold space and to instead try to fix the issue?
It's interesting. I wouldn't say it's a lack of resiliency we don't like to be around uncomfortable feelings. We don't like when we say to somebody like, don't worry, it's going to be okay. That's actually more like you're making me uncomfortable because you're crying. You're making me uncomfortable because you are not coping. You're making me uncomfortable because this is heavy lifting right now. So often that goodwill and that good intention when we're trying to fix other people is actually a strategy to manage our own discomfort, Michael. It's actually not about them. It's about us. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of character to say, you know what, I can't fix this, but I'll be with you through it. And recognizing that it is uncomfortable. And with my work in resiliency, like I've worked with people in some horrific circumstances, some pretty overwhelming situations. And when people ask me, like, how do you work with kids who've gone through such difficult seasons or families or communities? I really feel as though the best response I can give them, Michael, is that I've actually just learned to be okay with the discomfort. I can sit with somebody who's crying and I've learned to not take it on. I care deeply about the people I work with, but I'm not carrying it. I'm not going to carry all of that and get down again in that well with them. I'll care deeply, but I know the kindest thing that I can do, the most helpful, the most kind of strategic approach to supporting someone is to let them be, but let them know they're not alone.
Why then, Robyne, I believe the phrase you used in the book is ultra human. Why is the ultra resilient human, the one who feels no pain, the one who is as resilient as they come? Why is that message of ultra resiliency and the book titles that scream the obscenities at us to just, suck it up and do life better? Why is that so popular?
Oh, great question. Okay. So I think it's popular for a lot of reasons. From a kind of a commercialism perspective, if you think about kind of like Nike, it was like, their slogan was like, just do it, right? Like, just do it, just get out there, try, do the best you can. And now it kind of shifted to the like, go ahead and try and do this, right? We hear these ultra marathoners, we hear people running through the desert for like 24 hours to raise money for charities. Like now there's just this enormous pressure to and again, I love David Goggins. He's a brilliant writer and he's a former Navy SEAL who wrote the book, Can't Hurt Me. His kind of way of seeing the world is like, be uncommon amongst the uncommon. Like he's just leveling up resiliency to a place that is brilliant for him and some of the persons in his group. A lot of us, like mom of 3 teenagers, 2 jobs, navigating dogs and cats and COVID and homeschooling and all of the different challenges. It's like, I don't need to be uncommon among the uncommon. I just need to have like a sense of being okay at the end of the night. Like when I kind of put my head on the pillow, I just want to say she did the best she could today. And to me, that's not saying that I've lowered the standard. I just am going to play a different game. So, there's a game out there where people are trying to be ultra human. That's great. And that's inspiring and motivating. And some people can really get on board with that. And it helps them kind of like hate themselves to where they're trying to get to. I get that. I just am not going to run that race. I'm going to go over here in my race, which accepts the reality of what my world is. And I'm going to strive for my excellence. And I think everyone's excellence looks different. And I surrendered perfectionism so long ago. Like as a parent, I realized, that's never going to be possible. But I realized that I could be really present. And my kids don't need a perfect parent. They needed a present parent. So again, it's getting into your lane that makes sense for you, getting to what your level of excellence. And, when you've gone through difficult seasons, everyone in your house being okay, that is a huge marker of success, right? If your kids are healthy and are making good choices and they still like you and want to hang out with you, to me, that's a pretty phenomenal marker of success. So I might not be running through deserts, but I'm pretty proud of what our okay looks like.
I've definitely interviewed a couple people who have done those 24-hour Saharan marathons, and no, don't sign me up for that. That then reminds me of something else you talk about in the book, which is stress, the difference between stress and distress.
Yeah.
Why is there a distinction there to be made? Why is that important that we understand that distinction?
Yeah, so I love this topic. So stress is actually normal. Like we're stress carrying beings. There is nothing wrong with experiencing stress. The reality is everything is stressful. Nature expresses stress in their growth and development. Like stress is totally normal. It's in our biology. But what we worry about is that when people hit that threshold, Michael, where there's too much cortisol, like their life is too conflict driven, too dramatic, too much, what happens is our bodies actually cross this threshold where it will start working against us. So when we have a kind of like that healthy dose of motivation and focus and goals and ideas about what we want to accomplish, that propels us forward in a really balanced, healthy way. But all of a sudden, if everything gets out of whack and it's too much, too long, too big, what happens then is we start to see this erosion of our sense of self. And I think of that distress period as this erosion. It's leading us towards a burnout where all of a sudden we're tired all the time. We're fatigued. And we're not talking about just I need to go to bed early tonight. I'm talking about like you're bone tired. You're cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, physically spent. You're tired is tired. Like you're that depleted. And I'm seeing a lot of folks that are there right now, given the current landscape with COVID. And what I also think about is there's a lot of things in our culture that tell people that that's normal, right? You're supposed to be like, if you're in certain service industries or certain places, it's like, you're supposed to feel like that. Like that's what it's going to be like. And then one day you're going to retire and then everything's going to be all right. But as we know, a lot of folks don't actually ever make it to that finish line. They don't make it to that finish line, or they retire and then they get sick right afterwards, because we need to make sure that we're practicing what we call emotional regulation. We'll visit distress often because that's part of our nature, but we just don't want to get stuck there. And I think a lot of folks have accepted that they're stuck there. And that brings me to kind of something else that I talk about in my work around, I often hear people say, Robyne, I don't have time for self-care. Like it feels like a luxury, or self-care is selfish, or people think like self-care is like spas and essential oils. That's not self-care. That's like self-luxury. That's I'm talking about bone basic self-care. And I see people who have neglected, Michael, their self-care for so long, they're actually practicing self-neglect, that they've actually lost hope that there's a different way to feel. So they just don't bother anymore. They don't bother trying. And I worry about folks who are stuck with self-neglect, because I feel as though everyone has a right to be well and to feel their best. So I'm worried about folks that are in that distress zone right now.
Is it really then difficult to convince someone who is in that state of, and maybe convince is the wrong word, who's in that state of self-neglect and distress, to then turn around and do the next right thing, the next hard thing? Is that a really difficult transition for them to make?
It doesn't need to be. It is a difficult transition because we are bombarded with all of this information of things that we ought to be doing. People should on us all day long. We should be drinking green things. We should be waking up at 5 a.m., the 4 a.m. club or whatever they call it. We should be getting 10,000 steps. We should be like, just think about all the things that we're supposed to be doing, right? We should be doing yoga, but we need to be doing HIIT training as well. We need high intensity intervals, but we need time under tension. Like, think about all of the information, and that's just on the physical realm of wellness. And then all of a sudden we're supposed to be like spiritual and reflective and meditate, and we're supposed to connect to our purpose, right? And then occupationally, we're supposed to be the best, and we're supposed to be striving. Financially, we're supposed to do this. Like, if you were to take all of the things that we're ought to and should be doing in each of the 8 dimensions of wellness, no wonder people accept self-neglect, because they're just literally paralyzed. They're like, think about it, read something that says you're supposed to eat kale. And then the next article is like, kale's bad for you, right? Flaxseed, it's great for you, but it causes cortisol spikes. Like, there is no right, clear answer. So people are like in paralysis of analysis, where they just don't even know what to do next. So part of what my role as an educator and a scholar is to literally bring some clarity. And I'm a behavioral scientist. So what I'm thinking about is, okay, so you don't need to do all of those things. Heck, you don't even have to do like 9/10 of those things. You need to do small behavioral habits that bring you the best return on your investment. And so I'm talking about simple, clear, practical, not radical, just absolute practical habits that make sense for you. And I think there's a lot of those out there that people can onboard to. But again, I think why people have such a hard time is the fact that we don't even know what's right. So we have to make sure we're listening really to the right people that align with our values on how we want to be and how we want to become.
What does it look like for you, Robyne?
Great question. Okay. So like total basics, you got to win your morning. You have to start your morning with a routine that makes you feel active and alert and ready. I want you to spend even just 20 minutes with yourself before you surrender your day to the world. So the first 20 minutes or so, I want you to literally develop a routine or a ritual that grounds you. Maybe get a little bit of movement in there, maybe have that hot cup of coffee, having those few minutes to just really set your intention on what kind of day you want to experience. So for me, I set the intention work-wise. At work, I want to feel focused. Nothing bothers me more than losing a day to like reactivity and randomness, where at the end of the day, you're like, I'm so exhausted, but I actually didn't do anything. Those days kind of bother me. With my family system, I want to be patient. I want to feel present and energized and like show up. All of the seasons with our families, they're so short and I don't want to miss a thing. So again, setting those intentions, 20 minutes, half an hour in the morning, win your morning, get your day. It's like your pregame ritual, right? The athletes, like, oh my gosh, when you think of athletes with their pregame rituals who've developed this into like craftsmanship, we know that they have better success in sport. And then on the other side of that, Michael, I think we need to close our day out. I think there's a lot of emphasis on like, you got to do great in the morning, but we have to sign off on the day. We need to create activities in the evening that quiet the mental chatter, that help us unwind, that help us like just reflect, land, really get settled, hold some peace. So that way you can get some sleep. And I talk to folks all the time who struggle with sleep. You won't be able to fall asleep if you don't have peace before you go to bed. You have to have peace and then you can surrender to recovery.
Beautiful. Love it.
Thanks.
Robyne, what is something you've learned recently?
Oh, okay. So this is my big win. Parkinson's principle. So Parkinson's principle is this idea that how much time, Michael, you give a task is how long the task is going to take. All right. So basically, if you give it 20 minutes, it'll take you 20 minutes. If you give yourself the weekend to clean out the garage, it's going to take you the weekend. If you give yourself 4 hours, boom, job's going to get done. So just last week, I was working with this high-level CEO because I work with people still one-on-one. And he was struggling with his to-do list. So he's like, Robyne, I just can't get it done. Like, I feel like I have not crossed the finish line since COVID started. So what I did is I had him write down all of the things that he had to get done that day at work. And next to it, using Parkinson's principle, we actually had him record how long each task was going to take. And we added it all up. I actually stopped this gentleman after 17 hours. I said, you have now crossed the threshold of 17 hours. That's why you're tired. That's why you're feeling overwhelmed. Like you literally are like every day going into these triple overtimes, trying to like be productive with your best energy. Doesn't work that way. So what I recently learned was Parkinson's principle is a brilliant tool for us to examine our to-do lists. And now that I've been doing that, I realized I kind of liked apparently about a 20-hour workday, which I know is not in line with my values. So that brought me back to some clarity where it's like, wow, that's why I'm feeling exhausted, or I'm feeling that my pace was off because I was putting too much energy in one category at the cost of another category, which was my activating my professional self was in high gear, but activating my home self was lagging a wee bit. So I had to recalibrate, had to course correct.
Oh, that's fantastic. Love that. Brought it full circle there. Robyne, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for not only writing a beautiful, kind book, but just your time today here on the show. Last question that I ask of all my guests. What is a question that you wish you were asked more?
I think the question I wished I was asked more was that idea about how do we make what matters most matter most? In the spirit of all of this noise and distractions, We all know what in our heart matters most, but how do we actually make committed action to bring what's in our heart and our soul into our everyday lives?
Wonderful. Love it. Absolutely, Robyne. Thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're very kind. Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Take good care, Michael.
I'm a personal trainer. I haven't mentioned that on this show yet, but one of the things I love to do is first thing when I wake up in the morning is go down into my basement gym and get in my workout and start my day that way, and then come upstairs and have a cup of coffee and be with my family. And so Robyne's advice to win the start of your day, start with a bang. She didn't say that, I am, it just resonates with me. And I hope it resonates with you. Too many of us wake up and immediately begin the sludge of our day. But if we can focus that time at the beginning of our day to really bring intentionality to the beginning of our day to set us up for a good, positive, resilient rest of our day, we're going to feel and look and act so much better than if we just succumb to the day without that intentionality. So many thanks to Robyne for joining me on the show this week. Just an incredible conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Please do me and Robyne a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions to find common ground. And if you like the conversations with amazing guests like Robyne that I have on each week, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Subscribing also helps the show gain more reach. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me. It's michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, and until then, keep asking questions.